The storm was alive that night, roaring across the land like an angry beast. Rain slammed against the old wooden roof, each drop sounding like tiny fists trying to break in. The wind howled through the cracks of the windows, making the glass shiver in its frame. Lightning split the sky again and again, painting the lonely house in sudden flashes of white. Every thunderclap rolled through the valley like the growl of something unseen, reminding anyone awake that nature was in control. Inside that house sat a man, cut off from the world, waiting for the storm to pass, yet not knowing that something far more dangerous was about to arrive at his door. Ethan Cole sat alone, staring at the weak fire that barely pushed back the darkness. The storm outside was deafening, but inside, the silence was heavier. A widower, he had grown used to nights without voices, without footsteps, without warmth. Yet suddenly, through the roar of the rain and the howl of the wind, came a sound that didn't belong. Knock, knock, knock. His heart jolted. No one ever came this far on nights like these. He froze, listening again, thinking maybe it was just the storm playing tricks. But the sound came once more. Slow, heavy, desperate. Someone was out there, standing in the storm, knocking on his door. When Ethan pulled the heavy door open, the storm rushed in with a roar, but louder still was the sight before him. A young woman stood there, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her pale face, water dripping from her trembling hands. Her dress clung tightly to her body, revealing the unmistakable curve of pregnancy. She looked fragile, almost broken, yet in her eyes burned a wild desperation, the look of someone running from something unseen. Rain streamed down her cheeks, mixing with tears she tried to hide. For a long moment, she said nothing. She only stood there in the darkness, her swollen belly rising and falling as if even breathing had become a battle. And then, in a voice cracked by fear and exhaustion, she whispered, "Please, help me." Her lips barely moved, yet the words cut through the storm like a blade. "Please, help me." Just 3 fragile words, but they carried the weight of terror, of exhaustion, of a soul on the edge of breaking. Her voice trembled, thin as a whisper, almost lost to the thunder that cracked overhead. She didn't beg with her hands. She didn't fall to her knees. She simply stood there, rain pouring off her like the sky itself was trying to drown her, and let those words hang heavy in the air. To Ethan, it felt less like a request and more like a warning, as if helping her might save her life, but endanger his own. Suspense gripped the room the moment her words faded into silence. Who was this woman, wandering alone on such a night? Why had the storm carried her to his doorstep of all places, when the valley stretched wide with other homes and safer shelters? Ethan's mind spun with questions, each heavier than the last. Was she truly a victim? Or was she bringing danger with her? The storm outside seemed to pound harder against the windows, echoing the pounding of his own heart. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the chill of fear crawl across his skin, not from the thunder or the lightning, but from the mystery standing in front of him. Ethan's hand hovered on the edge of the door, torn between instinct and compassion. Every lesson life had taught him whispered that strangers carried trouble, especially ones who appeared on stormy nights with no explanation. And yet looking at her, shaking, soaked, one arm wrapped protectively around her swollen belly, he couldn't bring himself to close the door. With a slow breath, he stepped aside. "Come in." His voice was quiet, almost unsure, as though the words betrayed his own caution. Clara, though he did not yet know her name, crossed the threshold, leaving the storm behind. As the door shut, the world outside vanished into darkness and thunder, and the world inside shifted forever. For a long while she sat in silence, her hands cupped around the steaming mug Ethan had placed before her. The firelight softened her shivering frame, casting shadows that flickered across her tired face. Finally, As if gathering the last of her strength, she lifted her eyes to his. Her voice was low, hesitant, carrying both fear and dignity. "My name is Clara. Clara Hayes." The syllables seemed fragile, like they might break in the air before reaching him. She said nothing more, no story, no explanation, only her name, as though it was both a confession and a shield. To Ethan, it was enough to feel the weight of mystery deepen, for behind that name, he sensed an ocean of secrets still locked away. Ethan's questions were gentle at first, almost casual, but they hung in the air like sparks waiting to catch fire. "Where did you come from? What brought you here?" Clara lowered her gaze, fingers tightening around the blanket he had given her. Each question seemed to press against a wound she could not open. She would smile faintly, then let the smile die before it reached her eyes. Instead of answers, she offered silence, or words so vague they only raised more questions. It was clear she carried a story, heavy and dangerous, but she was not ready to share it. And the way she avoided his eyes made Ethan wonder. Was she protecting herself, or was she protecting him from the truth? As the firelight grew steadier, Ethan's eyes lingered on her face. At first, he thought it was just the exhaustion of the storm that made her look so fragile. But then he saw it. Faint marks along her wrist, a shadow of a bruise hidden beneath the sleeve she tried to pull tighter. Her cheek carried a fading line, not from accident, but from something harsher, something deliberate. And when her gaze finally met his, the truth was louder than words. Behind those tired eyes lived fear, deep, raw, unspoken fear. It wasn't the storm outside she dreaded. It was something or someone far more dangerous waiting beyond the safety of these walls. Ethan rose to place another log on the fire, but something made him pause. The glass of the window rattled in the wind, and for a moment he thought it was only the storm. Then, in the flash of lightning, he saw it, a shape, tall, unmoving, lurking just beyond the glow of the house. His breath caught. The figure wasn't part of the trees. It wasn't swaying with the storm. It was watching. His skin prickled as he blinked, but the darkness swallowed it whole before he could be sure. Slowly, he turned back to Clara. Her face had gone pale, her lips trembling as though she already knew what he had seen. The storm was no longer the only danger outside. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the hiss of rain against the roof. Ethan's questions finally pressed too hard, and Clara's defenses cracked. Her voice shook as she spoke, each word carrying the weight of shame and fear. "I wasn't just running from the storm," she whispered, eyes fixed on the flames. "I was running from him, my husband." She didn't say his name, as if even speaking it might summon him to the door. Her fingers dug into the blanket around her shoulders, knuckles white with the memory of his grip. She admitted he was powerful, respected by some, but cruel behind closed doors. Every bruise, every flicker of terror in her eyes now had a name, and it made Ethan realize the shadow outside might not have been a trick of the storm at all. Later, when Clara finally drifted into a restless sleep by the fire, Ethan's uneasy mind refused to rest. His eyes wandered to the small leather bag she had set near the door. He told himself not to look, that it wasn't his place. But something about her story gnawed at him. Slowly, almost guiltily, he loosened the clasp. Inside, he found things that didn't belong to a woman fleeing in desperation. Fine silk cloth, a golden locket engraved with a crest he didn't recognize, and letters sealed with wax, written in a hand too steady for someone on the run. His chest tightened. Clara had painted a picture of a hunted wife escaping cruelty, yet the bag whispered of wealth, of secrets, of a life she hadn't spoken of. Closing it quickly, he glanced at her again. Her face soft in sleep, but her fingers curled tightly, as though she feared the world might steal everything she held inside. Ethan leaned back in his chair, but his eyes kept drifting to the bag, to the locket that gleamed in his memory, to the sealed letters that carried names she had never spoken. A knot formed in his chest. Her words had been filled with pain, and yet the pieces did not fit. Was she truly a victim, or was she weaving a story to earn his shelter? His mind battled itself, one side aching to believe her tears, the other warning him that danger often wore a fragile face. Every glance at her sleeping form, every flicker of shadow across her bruised skin, deepened his conflict. Trust her, and he might invite ruin. Doubt her, and he might turn away a soul who had nowhere else to go. The fire cracked, but Ethan's thoughts were louder. What if the truth she hid was far darker than the storm outside? The cabin felt smaller with every passing hour, the air heavy with words left unspoken. Ethan found himself pacing, torn between the evidence in her bag and the sorrow etched on her face. When Clara stirred awake, her eyes met his, wide, fragile, pleading. For a moment, sympathy softened him, reminding him of his late wife's eyes in her final days, eyes that had also carried unspoken pain. But then he remembered the golden locket, the letters, the things that didn't belong to a woman running for her life. Fear crept in, whispering that he had invited danger across his threshold. Every time she winced in pain, he wanted to protect her. Every time she avoided a question, he wanted to push her out into the storm. Between those two urges, Ethan felt himself unraveling, unsure which voice to trust, his compassion or his caution. Just as Ethan opened his mouth to ask another question, the sound came, bang, bang, bang. This time it was no gentle plea, no weak cry for help. It was forceful, urgent, the kind of knock that demanded entry. The door shuddered under the blows, dust falling from the frame. Clara gasped, clutching her belly as if the very sound had struck her, her face drained of color, and in her eyes flashed the kind of terror only a hunted soul could know. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. Whoever stood outside was not seeking shelter from the storm. They were seeking her. The fire cracked, the rain howled, and in that moment Ethan knew the storm was no longer his greatest fear. Ethan's hand tightened on the door handle, his breath shallow as the pounding continued. When he finally pulled it open, two figures loomed in the stormlight. Their coats were heavy, their boots caked in mud, but their eyes were sharp and searching. Rain streamed from their hats as one stepped forward, his voice cutting through the thunder. "We're looking for a woman," he said coldly. "Her name is Clara. She doesn't belong here." The other man said nothing, but his gaze swept past Ethan's shoulder, trying to peer inside. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Behind him, he knew Clara was listening, frozen with fear. The stranger's tone wasn't of concern, but of possession, like hunters demanding the return of prey. In that instant, Ethan realized this was no accident. Clara had been followed, and danger had arrived at his very door. Ethan held their stare, the storm whipping around him, cold rain slipping past the doorframe onto the floor. His pulse thundered in his ears, but his voice came out steady, almost too calm. "No one's here but me," he said, forcing the lie past dry lips. The taller man narrowed his eyes, unconvinced, while the other leaned sideways, trying to catch a glimpse into the dim cabin. Ethan shifted his body, blocking the doorway with his frame, every muscle tight as a drawn bow. Behind him, he thought he heard Clara's sharp breath, the faint creak of the floor where she crouched. The strangers exchanged a look, suspicion flickering in their eyes, but for the moment they did not push past him. Ethan's words hung in the air like a fragile thread, one wrong move away from snapping. For a long, heavy moment the two men said nothing, their eyes narrowing as if trying to peel the truth off Ethan's face. Then, with a sharp snort, the taller one stepped back into the rain. "If she comes this way, you'll tell us," he muttered, though it sounded more like a command than a request. The other man leaned closer, his voice low and edged like a knife. "We'll be back, and if you're lying, you'll regret it." Their boots splashed in the mud as they turned, vanishing into the storm. Ethan shut the door quickly, his hands trembling now that their eyes were no longer on him. But the warning clung to the air like smoke. They weren't gone for good. They were hunting, and sooner or later, they would return. The moment the door latched shut, Clara staggered forward, her face pale and her hands shaking as she clutched at Ethan's arm. The strength she had carried until now collapsed all at once, and her voice cracked like glass. "Please don't send me away," she sobbed, her words tumbling out between gasps. Tears mingled with the rain still dripping from her hair, tracing lines down her bruised cheeks. She sank to her knees on the wooden floor, one hand cradling her swollen belly, the other reaching out as if clinging to the last lifeline she had. "If they take me back, I won't survive. My baby won't survive." The desperation in her eyes was raw, the kind that stripped away all doubt and left only truth. In that instant, Ethan felt the full weight of her terror and the dangerous choice resting on his shoulders. Later that night, when Clara finally cried herself into an uneasy sleep, Ethan moved to the window, hoping the storm had carried the strangers far away. But as lightning tore across the sky, his stomach dropped. Out beyond the tree line, half hidden by the sheets of rain, he saw them. Two figures standing still among the shadows. They weren't leaving. They were watching, waiting. Their shapes vanished when the darkness fell back in, but Ethan knew they were there, patient as wolves circling prey. His breath fogged the glass, his fists clenching helplessly. They hadn't given up. They were simply biding their time. And when the storm passed, they would come again. The storm gave way to quieter skies. But inside Ethan's cabin, the tension lingered like a shadow that refused to lift. Days passed in uneasy rhythm, each sunrise bringing with it the same dread. Would this be the day the men returned? Clara rarely stepped beyond the door, afraid even of the open air. She moved quietly around the small home. Her presence felt more in the soft clinking of dishes or the careful folding of blankets than in words. Ethan noticed how she avoided the windows, how she startled at every creak of the floorboards, how her eyes never lost that restless flicker. The world outside carried danger, so she shrank into his hidden corners, a stranger nesting in his silence. And though Ethan gave her shelter, he knew this fragile arrangement could not last forever. At first, Ethan kept his distance, offering her food and fire, but little more. Yet as the days slipped quietly into one another, Clara began to weave herself into the rhythm of his lonely home. She would sweep the floor while he chopped wood outside. She patched an old torn shirt of his with trembling but careful hands. When he returned from tending the animals, he found a pot of stew warming by the fire. Simple, but filled with an effort that spoke louder than words. Each small gesture chipped away at the wall he had built around his heart since his wife's death. And though doubt still lingered in his mind, Ethan began to see something in Clara's eyes that was not just fear. It was gratitude and a quiet plea to be trusted. One evening, as the fire painted soft light across the cabin walls, silence gave way to words neither of them had planned to speak. Ethan found himself telling her of his wife, the illness that had taken her too soon, the nights he had sat by this same fire with only grief for company. His voice faltered, but Clara listened with eyes full of quiet sorrow. Then, after a long pause, she spoke of her own life, a marriage that had begun with promises but turned into chains, a home that felt more like a prison than shelter. Her words spilled out slowly, broken, as though each memory cut her on its way out. In that fragile exchange, pain met pain, and for the first time Ethan felt less alone, and Clara felt less like a stranger. Late one night, when Clara had finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, Ethan's eyes were drawn once more to the worn leather bag resting near the hearth. Something inside him whispered not to look, that trust once broken could never be mended, but his hands moved anyway. With careful fingers, he unfastened the flap and pulled out a folded letter, sealed but already creased from travel. The wax was broken. He unfolded it, expecting nothing more than a note of escape or plea for help. Instead, the words froze his blood. It wasn't a letter of fear. It was a letter of arrangement, written in Clara's own hand, speaking of wealth, of hidden plans, and of a man's name that was not her husband's. Betrayal stained every line. Ethan's chest tightened as the firelight danced across the ink. Was the woman he had sheltered truly a victim? Or had he been dragged into a trap carefully spun by her secrets? The air between them grew heavy after Ethan confronted her with the letter, his voice sharp with disappointment, his eyes clouded with hurt. Clara tried to speak, her lips trembling, but no excuse could erase the truth written on the page. Finally, as tears streaked her face, she broke. Her voice came out as a whisper, so faint it was almost lost beneath the crackle of the fire. The child may not be his. The words hung in the room like thunder after lightning, impossible to take back. Ethan froze, his heart slamming in his chest. The storm outside had stilled, but inside the cabin, a greater storm had begun. If she wasn't carrying her husband's child, then whose was it? And why had she come to him? The silence that followed carried more danger than any knock at the door. The days grew heavier, and Clara's strength began to fade like a candle burning too fast. Her steps grew slower, her breaths shorter, until even the smallest tasks left her trembling. Ethan noticed the way she pressed her hand to her belly more often, her face tightening as though fighting pain she dared not speak of. Then one night, as thunder rolled once more across the valley, a sharp cry escaped her lips. She doubled over, clutching her stomach, her body racked with sudden, violent contractions. Panic surged through Ethan as he rushed to her side, realizing the truth. Her labor had come too soon. The storm outside roared back to life, and within the cabin, another storm began, one that neither of them could escape. The question was no longer who hunted Clara. It was whether she and the child would survive the night. As Clara cried out in pain, the heavens seemed to answer. The calm that had briefly settled shattered in an instant, replaced by the roar of a storm fiercer than before. Wind screamed through the cracks of the cabin, rattling the shutters as if the house itself was under attack. Rain hammered the roof with a relentless fury, drowning out her ragged breaths. Lightning split the night, flooding the room in blinding flashes, while thunder rolled so violently it shook the floor beneath Ethan's boots. Nature itself had turned violent, echoing the chaos inside the cabin. The storm outside thrashing with rage, the storm within thrashing with fear and life. Ethan's heart pounded. It felt as though the world was breaking apart at the very moment Clara was fighting to bring new life into it. The pounding at the door returned, louder than the thunder, shaking the cabin with each blow. Clara's cries filled the room, her fingers gripping Ethan's arm like a lifeline. Sweat streamed down her face, tears mixing with the storm's fury. Ethan stood frozen, every muscle torn between instinct and fear. If he opened the door and gave her up, the danger would leave with her. But so would his honor, and perhaps her life. If he defied them, he risked his own blood spilling on these wooden floors, risked inviting death into his home. The weight of the choice pressed down on him like the storm pressing on the roof above. Protect her, and he might lose everything. Betray her, and he would lose himself. Through the agony of her contractions, Clara's walls finally crumbled. Her hands clutched the blanket, her voice shaking as sobs spilled from her chest. "I can't hide it anymore," she cried, gasping between waves of pain. "I was never just running from a cruel husband. I was running from a lie. The man I married only wanted power, but my heart belonged to someone else, this child. It's his, not Richard's." Her words came out broken, raw, drenched in fear and shame. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at Ethan with pleading eyes. He will never forgive me. He will never forgive this child. He will hunt us until we are gone. In that moment, every secret she had carried crashed into the open, and the storm outside seemed to roar louder, as if the world itself reacted to her truth. Clara's scream tore through the cabin, sharper than the thunder, her body convulsing as the first waves of birth overtook her. Ethan knelt by her side, panic and determination warring in his chest. And then, bang! The front door rattled violently on its hinges. Another crash followed, wood splintering under the force of fists or boots. The storm outside howled as if cheering them on. Clara clutched Ethan's hand, her face contorted with pain and terror. "They're here," she gasped. Ethan's heart hammered. The child was coming, fragile and unstoppable, at the very moment death pressed against the door. Each slam shook the cabin harder, each contraction ripped a cry from Clara's throat. The two storms, one of nature, one of men, collided in that single moment, and Ethan knew. Before this night ended, life and death would stand in the same room. Between gasps of pain, Clara's voice broke free, raw and desperate, as though the storm itself demanded she speak the truth at last. "You don't understand," she sobbed, clutching her swollen belly. "Richard isn't just cruel. He is powerful. He owns men, land, fear itself. To him I am property. And this child—" She choked on the words, her tears falling hot onto the blanket. "This child isn't his. It belongs to the only man I ever loved, the one he took from me. That is why he hunts me. Not because I ran, but because this baby is proof of his failure, proof of my betrayal." Her face twisted in agony as another contraction ripped through her body, but her eyes held Ethan's with a desperate plea. "If he finds me, he will kill us both." The truth landed heavier than thunder, and in that moment Ethan realized the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm now raging within these walls. Ethan's chest heaved as Clara's words echoed through the cabin. The fire snapped and hissed, casting trembling shadows across her tear-streaked face. For a moment, the weight of her confession pressed down on him like a stone. Lies, betrayal, secrets. It was all tangled in her story. But when his eyes fell to her trembling hands cradling her belly, something inside him shifted. The child was not guilty of any of it. It was not born of power, cruelty, or revenge. It was only life, fragile and blameless, struggling to enter a hostile world. Ethan's grief for his lost wife, his doubts about Clara, his fear of the men outside, all of it faded beneath one undeniable truth. This baby was innocent. And innocence deserved protection, even if it cost him everything. Ethan knelt beside Clara, his hand gripping hers as her body trembled with pain. The pounding at the door grew louder, wood splintering, but his focus stayed on her and the life she carried. His jaw tightened, eyes blazing with a resolve he hadn't felt since the days he fought to save his dying wife. "Listen to me," he whispered, voice firm even against the storm. "I don't care what you've done or who's out there. You and this child are under my roof now, and as long as I breathe, no one will take you from me." The words weren't just a promise. They were a vow, carved into his very soul. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara's terror softened, replaced by a glimmer of hope. Outside, fists hammered against the door, but inside, Ethan had already chosen his battle. The next crash came like thunder striking wood. The old hinges groaned, the frames splitting with each violent blow. Dust rained from the beams above, the floor trembling under their boots outside. Clara screamed, clutching Ethan's arm as another contraction tore through her body, her voice swallowed by the storm. Ethan grabbed the rifle from above the mantel, his knuckles white, his heart pounding like the fists on the door. Then it happened. A deafening crack as the door burst inward, slamming against the wall with a force that shook the whole cabin. The fire guttered, the wind roared inside, and in that single moment Ethan knew. Darkness had stepped across his threshold. The door flew open, and the storm came with it. Wind howling, rain spraying across the wooden floor. Two dark figures surged through the threshold, their boots thundering like war drums. Their eyes glinted with cold intent, scanning the room until they found Clara huddled near the fire, writhing in pain. One of them sneered, hand reaching for her as if she were nothing more than stolen property to be dragged back. The other pulled a blade from beneath his coat, its edge catching the firelight in a cruel flash. Ethan stepped forward before they could reach her, his rifle leveled, his body braced between the men and the woman behind him. The cabin crackled with tension, every heartbeat louder than the storm outside. This was no longer a house of refuge. It had become a battlefield. With a roar that drowned even the thunder, Ethan lunged forward, swinging the butt of his rifle into the chest of the first intruder. The man stumbled back, crashing into the doorframe, but the second was quicker. His blade slashed through the air, grazing Ethan's arm. Pain burned hot, but Ethan did not falter. Years of grief and silence now poured out as fury, every strike fueled by the vow he had made. He fought not for himself, but for Clara and the child who had not yet drawn its first breath. The cabin shook with the struggle. Wood splintering, firelight flickering wildly, Clara's cries echoing through the chaos. Ethan's fists struck, the rifle cracked against bone, his body battered yet unyielding. He was one man against two, but in that moment, he fought with the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. The struggle left the cabin in ruins, chairs overturned, blood staining the wooden floor, the fire nearly smothered by the chaos. And then, above the storm and the violence, a new sound filled the room, a newborn's cry, sharp and alive. Clara, pale with exhaustion yet fierce with a mother's strength, cradled the tiny child against her chest. Her body trembled, but her eyes blazed with defiance as she rose unsteadily to her feet. The men froze, their weapons still in hand, but their gaze faltered when met with hers. No longer the frightened woman who had knocked on Ethan's door, Clara now stood as a shield of flesh and spirit, daring them to harm her child. "You'll never touch him," she whispered, her voice shaking yet unbreakable. In that moment, courage eclipsed fear, and even the storm outside seemed to bow to the power of a mother's vow. Outside, the night split apart with fury. Lightning tore the sky into jagged pieces, thunder rolled like drums of war, and rain lashed the earth as if the heavens themselves were enraged. Inside, the chaos was no different. Blades flashed in the firelight, boots pounded against the wooden floor, and Ethan's ragged breaths mixed with Clara's cries as she clutched her newborn. Every crash of thunder seemed to answer the clash of fists and steel within the cabin, as though nature itself mirrored their struggle. The storm rattled the windows, shook the roof, and screamed through the cracks, a wild chorus echoing the violence of men. It was no longer just a house. It was the eye of a tempest, where life and death wrestled beneath one roof while the world outside roared its approval. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos broke apart. A final blow landed, a body crashed against the wall, and the cabin went still. The fire sputtered low, casting faint, trembling shadows across broken furniture and blood-stained wood. The storm outside still raged, but within the house, silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Clara clutched her newborn to her chest, her wide eyes darting through the smoke and darkness, searching for Ethan. One of the men lay motionless near the hearth. The other groaned faintly in the shadows. But Ethan was nowhere in sight. Her breath caught in her throat. In the aftermath of the storm, only one question remained, louder than the thunder itself. Who had survived? At last, the night surrendered. The first pale light of dawn crept over the valley, painting the broken sky in muted shades of gold and gray. The storm, which had roared with such fury, now lay quiet, leaving only the soft drip of rainwater from the cabin's eaves. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and damp wood, heavy with the memory of struggle. Shattered furniture lay strewn across the floor, but in the silence, a fragile peace returned. Clara sat near the hearth, her newborn wrapped tightly against her chest, its tiny breaths rising and falling in rhythm with her own. Her eyes lifted to the window where the sun finally pierced through the thinning clouds, a reminder that the longest night had ended. Somewhere in the ruins of fear and violence, hope had managed to survive. Clara's body trembled with exhaustion, but she was alive. Against all odds, she had endured the night, her spirit unbroken despite the storm and the terror that had hunted her. In her arms, the baby stirred softly, letting out a faint cry before settling again against her heartbeat. She pressed her lips to the child's damp forehead, tears streaming down her face, not of fear this time, but of relief. Every bruise, every scar, every sleepless mile she had walked to reach this place had led to this fragile miracle. The world outside was scarred and broken, but within her embrace lay proof that new beginnings were possible. The baby was safe. She was safe. And for the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might hold something more than pain. Word of what happened in the storm spread quickly through the valley. Richard Hayes, once feared and obeyed, no longer held the same power over the town. His men, beaten and scattered, carried back tales of defiance, of a woman who refused to bow and a man who stood against the odds to protect her. The whispers grew louder than his threats, and soon the villagers, who had long lived under his shadow, began to see him for what he truly was, a tyrant weakened by his own cruelty. The fear that had chained their voices broke, leaving Richard isolated, his grip over the town crumbling like rotted wood in the rain. Where there had been silence, now there was courage. Where there had been control, now there was freedom. The storm had washed more than the land that night. It had swept away his reign. For years, Ethan's cabin had been nothing more than a shelter of wood and stone, a place where silence pressed harder than the storms outside. He had lived as a man half alive, haunted by grief and waiting for nothing. But as he looked at Clara cradling her newborn, something within him shifted. The loneliness that had weighed on him like chains began to loosen. In their frightened arrival, he had found not burden, but meaning. Protecting them had forced his heart to beat with purpose again, to fight, to hope. He was no longer just a widower hidden from the world. He was a guardian, a companion, a man reborn through the courage to stand for someone else. For the first time in years, Ethan did not dread the dawn. He welcomed it, because it promised a life worth living again. The storm had passed, the night had surrendered, and in its place stood a new beginning. What entered Ethan's door that night was not just a frightened woman or a newborn child. It was the return of hope, the rebirth of purpose, the reminder that even in the darkest hours, light can still find a way in. Life has a way of disguising its blessings, often arriving in moments we least expect and in forms we are too afraid to welcome. As Ethan looked at Clara and the baby, he understood a truth he would carry for the rest of his days. Sometimes the knock we fear the most is the one that saves us.